What would you do if the prayer you refused to say was the one you needed most? On a Tuesday afternoon, a man of God drew a line in the sand over a string of beads, a line between his faith and another's. The air in his office was still and smelled of lemon polish and old paper. Outside, the city of Detroit hummed with the steady, indifferent rhythm of traffic on the John C. Lodge freeway. He did not know that his own time was being measured, not in days or years, but in the handful of hours it takes for the sun to drop below the horizon. The ticking of his own heart was a clock he could not hear. Pastor David Franklin's world was built of straight lines and solid wood. The pews in his church, the New Hope Community Chapel in Detroit's North End, were oak, set in perfect, unyielding rows. The spine of every King James Bible on his office shelf was unbroken, the gold lettering still sharp. His faith was like the brick walls of his building, strong, orderly, and with no room for the ornate curvatures of traditions he did not hold. David was a good man, a leader whose sermons on grace were quoted back to him in the aisles of the Meier on 8 Mile Road. He was a pillar, a black pastor whose voice could soothe a grieving widow or ignite a call for neighborhood action. But his certainty was a fortress, and its walls were high. The office window behind him looked out over a small, patchy lawn, and beyond that, the weathered siding of the houses along Horton Avenue. The room was a reflection of his soul, meticulously organized, scripturally sound, and utterly devoid of mystery. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool surface of his desk, a gesture of control and ownership. This was his ministry, his truth, carved from the bedrock of the Word alone. No statues, no icons, no intermediaries, just God's text and the hearts of his people. Yet, a quiet hum of something unsettled lived beneath the floorboards of his conviction. It was the low frequency of a memory he kept locked away, a silence in the house of his spirit that no hymn could completely fill. He adjusted a stack of bulletins, aligning their edges with the precision of a surgeon. Everything in its proper place, everything accounted for. The memory was of fluorescent lights and the sterile smell of antiseptic. It came to him not in a flood, but in sharp, unwelcome fragments, like finding shards of glass in soft earth. He was 20 years old, standing in a corridor of St. John Hospital on the east side of Detroit, his back against the cool, pale green wall. His mother was in a room down that hall, her world shrinking to the size of a starched white bed. She had been a woman of deep, unquestioning faith, a faith that smelled of candle wax and incense from her weekly visits to the old St. Hyacinth Roman Catholic Church. In her final days, her hands were seldom empty. They were wrapped around a string of smooth, dark beads, her rosary. He remembered the faint, rhythmic click they made as her thumb moved from one bead to the next, her lips whispering a name he could not bring himself to honor. He had begged her to pray with him, to his God, in his words, to accept the simple, direct promise of salvation he had found. She had only smiled, a tired, patient smile, and her fingers had tightened on the small silver crucifix. When she died, the rosary was still in her hand. The doctors were kind, the nurses compassionate, but David felt nothing but the cold, hollow echo of unanswered prayer. He saw those beads not as a comfort, but as a barrier, a string of failed petitions that had stood between his mother and a healing that never came. He left the hospital that day and walked for miles, the gray Detroit sky pressing down on him. He built his own faith on the foundation of that rejection, creating a theology as a bulwark against the quiet, clicking sorrow of his mother's last prayer. He vowed he would never let such an object, such a ritual, stand between a soul and its creator. The clock on his office wall read 2 p.m. when the knock came. It was soft, hesitant. He opened the door to find Elena Rossi, a small, stooped woman from the neighborhood whose family had lived on the same block for 50 years, long before the demographics had shifted. Her face was a roadmap of worry, and in her gnarled hands she clutched a simple, wooden rosary. She explained that her grandson, Marco, was at Children's Hospital of Michigan, his body burning with a fever the doctors couldn't break. "Pastor," she began, her voice thin but clear, "I see the good you do. I know you are a man of God. Please, will you pray with me?" David nodded, his expression softening with pastoral concern. He gestured for her to sit, reaching for his Bible. "Of course, Mrs. Rossi. Let us go to the Lord in prayer." But she didn't sit. She held out the rosary. "Please, Pastor, for my Marco, pray this with me. For the Blessed Mother to intercede." David's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly. He looked from her pleading eyes to the string of beads. He saw not a tool of prayer, but the ghost of his mother's hospital room, the symbol of a faith that had in his mind failed. He chose his words carefully, his voice gentle but firm. "Mrs. Rossi, my faith is direct. I pray to the Father, through the Son. I don't use objects, and I do not pray to saints or to Mary. That is not my way." Her face fell. A parishioner waiting in the hall saw the old woman's shoulders slump. The keys in the church secretary's hand fell to the floor, the metallic clatter echoing in the sudden, heavy silence. "I will pray for Marco with all my heart," David assured her, "but I cannot pray this." She nodded slowly, her hand closing around the beads, and turned away without another word. As she left, David felt a sharp, unfamiliar pang in his chest, a sensation he dismissed as the strain of a difficult conversation. At 2:11 p.m., he sat back down at his desk, the silence of the room now feeling less like peace and more like a vacuum. 4 hours later, the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of pressure and light. It began as he was locking the church doors for the evening. The pang in his chest returned, no longer a dull ache but a hot, constricting band of iron. His breath caught in his throat. The brass keys slipped from his numb fingers and skittered across the concrete steps of New Hope Community Chapel. The setting sun cast long shadows down Horton Avenue, turning the familiar street into an alien landscape. He collapsed onto the steps, his vision tunneling, the sound of his own ragged gasps swallowed by the evening traffic. A woman walking her dog screamed. Someone called 911. The paramedics from the station on Woodward Avenue arrived in minutes, their faces a blur of focused urgency. Inside the ambulance, the rhythmic beep of the cardiac monitor was a frantic, failing drumbeat. His wife, Sarah, met them at the emergency entrance of Detroit Receiving Hospital, her face pale under the harsh fluorescent glare. Whispers had already started to ripple through his congregation. The secretary had told the head deacon about the old Italian woman and the Rosary. The deacon had called his wife. The news spread through texts and phone calls, a mix of concern and a kind of hushed, fearful speculation. In the emergency room, as a team of doctors and nurses worked over him, a sense of detachment washed over David. He could see the strained faces, hear the shouted medical terms. "Ventricular fibrillation! Get the paddles!" But it all seemed to be happening to someone else. He was adrift in a sea of his own failing biology, the fortress of his certainty crumbling with every beat his heart refused to make. The crucible was not fire, but ice. As the doctors fought for him, David slipped into a place devoid of sensation. It was not a tunnel of light or a gathering of ancestors. It was a profound and terrifying emptiness, a silent, starless void. He had no body, no voice, no thoughts, only an awareness of absolute isolation. The feeling was not of judgment, but of absence, the total, complete absence of the God he had preached with such conviction his entire adult life. On the other side, in the world of light and sound, his body convulsed on the gurney. The monitor beside his bed drew a flat green line. 6:47 p.m. A nurse called the time. For 47 seconds, his heart was still. Doctors administered another shock. His chest arched. Sarah, watching through a small window in the waiting room door, pressed her hands to the glass, her silent prayers a stark contrast to the clinical chaos inside. David felt a coldness so deep it seemed to absorb all possibility of warmth. It was the cold of a universe without a creator, a silence without a word. The rigid lines of his theology offered no comfort here. The scriptures he had memorized, the sermons he had delivered, were like stones dropped into a bottomless well. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone, a consciousness untethered from grace itself. The fortress had not just been breached, it had never existed at all. Then, in the deepest part of the void, a change. It began not as a sight, but as a scent, faint and unmistakable. The smell of roses, not cloying or artificial, but fresh and alive, as if a garden were blooming in the vacuum. A single point of light appeared in the distance, soft and pearlescent, pulsing gently like a resting heart. It did not banish the darkness, but made it bearable, a frame for its gentle radiance. A sound followed, the pure, resonant toll of a single bell, a sound that seemed to create space and time where there had been none. He felt a presence. It was not God the Father on a throne or Jesus the Son with outstretched hands. It was feminine, ancient, and steeped in a sorrow so profound it felt like the grief of the world itself. There were no words, only a powerful, silent communication of love and pity. He saw an image in his mind. 2 hands, worn with work and age, holding a simple wooden rosary. They offered it not as a challenge or a demand, but as a gift, a tool, a way back. As the light grew, it seemed to fill the hospital room he could not see. Outside, a night nurse taking a smoke break on St. Antoine Street glanced up at the 3rd-floor window. She saw a soft rose-gold light bloom within the room and then fade, a phenomenon she would later tell her husband was just a trick of the streetlights, but which she would never entirely believe. The flat line on the monitor jagged upwards. A steady, rhythmic beep returned. A doctor looked up, his mask unable to hide his astonishment. "We've got a pulse." When David Franklin opened his eyes, the first word he spoke was not God or Sarah. It was a name, whispered through a dry throat and cracked lips. Rossi. His wife, weeping with relief at his bedside, was confused. "David, what? The doctor?" He shook his head, a small, weak gesture. The insistence in his eyes was fierce, a fire rekindled in the ashes. He needed to find the old woman. For 3 days he recovered, his doctors calling it miraculous. On the 4th day, against their advice, he signed himself out. Sarah drove him, her silence a mixture of fear and wonder. He didn't direct her home or to his church. He told her to drive north on Woodward Avenue, past the Detroit Institute of Arts, past the Historical Museum. He told her to stop at a building he had passed 1,000 times, but never truly seen. Our Lady of the Rosary Catholic Church. It was a beautiful, imposing stone structure, a relic of a different Detroit. He walked slowly, his body still weak, up the stone steps and through the heavy wooden doors. The air inside was cool and smelled of old wood, beeswax, and a faint trace of incense. In a side chapel, illuminated by a bank of flickering votive candles, an old woman was kneeling. It was Elena Rossi. Her head was bowed, and her fingers moved slowly over the beads of her simple wooden rosary. David walked over and, without a word, knelt on the hard stone floor beside her. He did not speak. He did not pray. He simply knelt, his head bowed, in the quiet, candle-lit presence of a faith he had not understood. It was an act of surrender, a silent admission that the house of God had many rooms, and he had been living in only one. The ripple began in the quietest of ways. The next morning, at Children's Hospital of Michigan, Marco Rossi's fever broke. His doctors couldn't explain the sudden turnaround, calling it a fortunate and rapid response to the antibiotics. Elena Rossi just kissed the wooden cross of her rosary and whispered, "Thank you." A few days later, a young man from Pastor Franklin's congregation, one who had always been vocal about his distrust of Catholic idolatry, organized a small group of volunteers. On a Saturday morning, they started cleaning up the litter and overgrown weeds on the block surrounding New Hope Community Chapel. When they finished, without any prompting, they crossed East Grand Boulevard and did the same for the grounds of Our Lady of the Rosary. The old priest of the parish watched them from his window, a slow smile spreading across his face. One of the paramedics who had responded to David's call, a man named Mike, who had been raised Catholic but hadn't been to Mass in 20 years, found his route taking him past the stone church. On an impulse, he pulled the ambulance over, stepped inside for just a moment, and sat in a back pew, the scent of the place stirring memories he thought were long buried. People began to talk, not in whispers of judgment, but in murmurs of curiosity and respect. The invisible walls between the two congregations, separated by only a few city blocks but a chasm of theology, began to feel a little more porous. An act of humility had become a quiet, unheralded act of healing for a small corner of the city. Pastor Franklin's sermons changed. They lost none of their scriptural force, but they gained a new dimension of humility. He spoke less of the fortress of faith and more of its endless frontiers. He did not abandon his church or his theology, but he expanded the boundaries of his heart. He and Sarah started an interfaith breakfast once a month, inviting leaders from the synagogue down the street and the priest from Our Lady of the Rosary. It was awkward at first, a gathering of polite strangers, but it slowly blossomed into a genuine fellowship, built on shared plates and a shared love for their city. David was often seen sitting in a back pew of the Catholic Church on weekday afternoons. He never took communion, never recited the prayers. He just sat in the silence, a quiet, respectful visitor. One day, a teenage girl from his own youth group asked him why. She held a Bible, her expression earnest and confused. He looked at her, and then at the simple wooden rosary Elena Rossi had given him, which he now kept in his desk drawer. "The Word of God is our foundation," he told her, his voice gentle. "It is the truest path I know. But I have learned that God has carved many paths up the same mountain. My way is not the only way. A prayer from the heart, in any language, in any tradition, reaches the same destination." He no longer saw the beads as a barrier, but as a reminder of his own pride, of a mother's love, and of a grace that had met him in the darkest, most silent place. There are moments that test the foundations of what we believe. They are not always grand or public, but they can redefine our world. Pastor Franklin's crisis was not about the superiority of one doctrine over another. It was about the discovery that a closed heart can be the most dangerous place to live. The truest faith is not the one that builds the highest walls, but the one that opens the most doors. His journey reminds us that God's love is not confined to the buildings we construct or the rituals we prefer. It meets us where we are, sometimes in the very traditions we have pushed away. The lesson is not to abandon our own path, but to respect the paths of others, and to have the humility to see the divine in places we least expect it. If this story touched you, like the video, subscribe to Why, and share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us your moment of unexpected grace in the comments.